joining. Now, we will be getting started very shortly. Just a heads up that we are recording this session and it will be made available to you after the presentation. As I said, we'll be starting very shortly, so do hang tight. Thanks. Time to get started. Well, welcome everyone to the briefing room for the fourth in a series of ClimateWorks webinars in an event titled Transport Moving to Zero. My name is Michael Lee and I'm the Senior Project Manager at ClimateWorks Australia. And you can find out a bit more about ClimateWorks at our website, climateworksaustralia.org. I work in particular on reducing carbon emissions from infrastructure, transport and energy, which is why I'm particularly pleased to be introducing this event, which relates to our new Moving to Zero report on decarbonising the transport sector. Before we introduce our speakers this afternoon, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands the ClimateWorks office is located. I pay my respect to the traditional owners and their elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you all for sharing this time with us. A reminder that for those of you who registered via Zoom will receive an email afterwards with links to resources that we'll be mentioning in this discussion. So do make sure you check your inbox and your spam folder in case it ends up there. We will be running this event today as a panel. Our two special guests will speak for about 5 minutes each, and then there will be plenty of time for you to ask them questions. If you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And our team will collate those questions and they'll put them to our guests as we go along. Now I would like to introduce you to Petra Stock, who will host the event today and introduce our guests. Over to you, Petra.
Thanks, Michael. I'm Petra Stock. I've been leading ClimateWorks Cities and Policy program. And ClimateWorks, as you may know, is an independent advisor assisting governments and business on pathways to net zero emissions. So it's really exciting that today's session is on transport. And this follows other webinars ClimateWorks has been doing on our decarbonisation futures research and also energy transitions. And those sessions were recorded just like this one will be. So if you're interested, you can check out any of our webinars on the ClimateWorks website. And after today, we're going to keep the series going. We've got an event on the 24th of June, which is on food and land, and that will be with our program manager at ClimateWorks, Ellie Court, who'll be in conversation with Verity Morgan-Schmidt from Farmers for Climate Action and Shegan Fan, who's a chair professor at the China Agricultural University. So keep an eye out for that. But now without further ado, let's get underway with this discussion on transport, which is perfectly timed because we've just released 2 reports on transport from ClimateWorks, including Moving to Zero, which is the first comprehensive guide for Australia to reach zero emissions in transport. And to talk all things transport today, we're really fortunate to have 2 distinguished guests. First, we have Behyad Jafari. Behyad is the CEO of the Electric Vehicle Council. He works with industry, government and the media to help accelerate the electrification of road transport for a more sustainable and prosperous Australia. And we've also got Terry Bickerton. He's the National Manager of Fleet for Australia Post, an organisation which is committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. And Terry manages one of the largest logistical fleets in the country, and thus he's got some hands-on experience to share today. I'm just going to start by providing a very quick overview of our recent Moving to Zero transport report, and then hand over to our guests to make some introductory remarks. And after our guests have spoken, I'll be asking them some questions, as well as those that come in from our viewers on Zoom. And as Michael said, if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask something anytime you like. So I'll just ask Sophie to click on the first slide. So just to talk a bit about our Moving to Zero report, which you can access on the ClimateWorks website. ClimateWorks has decided to focus on transport at this point in time because this is one of Australia's largest and fastest growing sources of emissions up until the coronavirus. And domestic transport, cars, trucks, trains, airplanes and ships makes up about 19% of our national emissions. Obviously, we've had a huge change as a result of the coronavirus, and we're now focusing as a country on economic recovery after the coronavirus, and we see that as an opportunity to help shift our transport networks towards zero emissions. And obviously, the other crisis that is critical to tackle climate change is not going away, and transport, in particular zero transport solutions, are a critical part of tackling climate change. And I'll just quickly ask for the next slide. So as I mentioned, this picture just shows roughly the makeup of those transport emissions. Largely the emissions from transport in Australia come from road transport, especially cars. And next slide, please. So our Moving to Zero report does go through zero emission solutions for each part of the transport system. So both passenger and freight travel across road, rail, sea and air. It looks at established solutions. So those that we've known about that are basically ready to be rolled out at scale to help bring our emissions down. And also on the next slide, some of the emerging areas where we'll need to focus some further investment and effort for some of these emerging solutions. So just the final slide on moving to zero. We've certainly seen, as a result of the coronavirus, and I'm sure Terry will have experienced this firsthand as Australia Post, that transport has had to radically shift. And that really gives us the opportunity now to refocus our efforts and reimagine our transport systems so that not only do we cut our emissions and head towards zero emissions in our transport systems, but we can also have quieter, healthier, cleaner cities. And by using economic stimulus measures to support sustainable transport, we can also help drive jobs and employment. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Behyad to talk more about electrifying our road transport. Thanks, Behyad.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for being here to give me some of your time and listen to me. And thanks as always to ClimateWorks for giving me a platform to come and speak to all your kind guests. I thought how I would spend this early time is to lay a bit of groundwork. I'll try to keep it brief because really the most fun part for me is to have as much of a discussion as we can in a format like this. Look forward to answering your questions. But where I wanted to start was by acknowledging that when we talk about the electric vehicle sector, the markets, its issues, challenges and opportunities, really we're talking about two separate things. And particularly here in Australia, we end up sort of collating or converging on what those two separate things are. So I wanted to separate them out to start with. First of all, we're talking about the global transition towards electric vehicles and towards zero emissions transport globally. The global discussion really being led based on developments of the technology and the development of the industry that surrounds it. A lot of discussion and excitement around the fact that the falling cost of batteries and the rising power and performance of batteries that drive electric vehicles are expected to fall under cost parity or sort of be cost competitive with traditional internal combustion engines throughout this decade, expecting that particularly that upfront price parity causing a large sort of lift off, an economic tipping point where you start to see a mass migration towards electric vehicles. And secondly, we're talking about the Australia's performance inside of the electric vehicle market. And so two very different things there, because something that you may have, if you read a bit about electric vehicles or you know a bit about electric vehicles, Australia's behind the rest of the world on this transition. And we can dive into a few of the key areas as to why and what we can do to fix them. So if we think about those challenges for Australia, and I'll draw some parallels here to what the rest of the world looks like and how we're different, we describe those three pillars as first and foremost around price. So there's obviously a very crucial, people only spend the money that they have. The fact that we have a limited availability of electric vehicle models across all different segments available in Australia, and those models that are available are usually in the luxury price segment. So first of all, dissecting that, we see that when we look at comparable markets, and if somebody wants to ask a question, there's a whole bunch of work that we do to decide what is a comparable market and what isn't, because of course you'll hear about sort of fantastic markets like Norway reaching above 50% market share already. But when we look at other comparable markets, thinking around North America, Canada, parts of the EU, parts of Asia, we start to see that their marketplace is largely driven by some level of government support, policy support, is today at around tipping, usually tipping over 5%, but in general around 3 to 5% market share for new vehicles being electric. And in Australia, that figure, the equivalent is about 0.7%, so still under 1% of new vehicle sales being electric. So really that first thing for us is what is causing a gap between our market of 0.7% towards these other comparable ones of 3 to 5? Analysing that gap's really important because it changes that conversation from people in very sort of niche scenarios that need to drive very long distances, hauling very heavy loads, or wherever else it may be, to saying, how do we move from the 6,700 electric vehicles we sold last year towards 40 to 50,000 electric vehicle sales that we should have sold in order to be up to date with what the global average is. So we're looking at that, the price and model availability. Well, what's easy to confuse here in Australia is what we have available to us, around 27 models of electric vehicles, about 19 of those being in the luxury price range, so above $60,000, and a majority of those, again, above $100,000. Then we're able to look at, well, what do other comparable markets and model availability look like? And that's where we can look at a country like the UK by being a right-hand drive market. They're very influential to our own market. And there they have now just under 30 models of electric vehicles available under $60,000 Australian equivalent. And really importantly, that's the price of those vehicles before any subsidy applies. So the prices get cheaper again after receiving a government subsidy. But importantly, why I sort of draw that out as a distinction is the first thing that policy and that incentives does is make the product available to consumers in the first place. The fact that it makes it cheaper and encourages them to buy it is, of course, what causes that pull factor. But by not having those in place, that's where you have that disparity where in Australia, we have now 7 models of vehicles available under $60,000. So already a huge gap that we can feel just by immediate measures taken here. Flowing on from that, looking at other other items that are impacted by what I just described in model availability is really a proxy for investment certainty. What we see as a car is essentially an investment made by a car company or a vehicle company. That naturally flows on to the availability of things like charging infrastructure, which causes that other major barrier around range anxiety of where can I charge a vehicle. Of course, some of that's informed by consumer sentiment, recognizing that your charging or refueling behavior changes when you drive an electric vehicle. You charge at home, you charge where you are actually going. So wherever there is electricity, you'll be charging your vehicle. But what we see right around the world and here in Australia is that when consumers are ready to purchase an electric vehicle, they do it in, they do a mental check of, have I seen charging stations, public charging stations made available? And if I can't picture the last time I've seen them, I'm not comfortable enough to buy an electric vehicle. So providing the certainty for that investment, again, you can, and this isn't very sophisticated economics here, you can understand that somebody building that charging station wants to see that there will be cars on the road because there will be their customers buying the electricity back from them. So a very circular relationship there. And that final barrier that we talk about is around consumer awareness. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you can imagine once you start getting cars on the road, you have that increases consumer awareness. Once manufacturers are bringing vehicles, they're spending money on advertising, spending money on sort of informational and educational campaigns to help teach people about the benefits of electric vehicles. And key to some of those benefits, so I'll probably just end on here, is recognizing often when we talk about these transitions, these technological transitions, we recognize, I guess, the pain associated, and there's certainly pain and difficulty associated with any technological transition. But what we've often failed to recognize is the pain that we've been going through all along. So when we look at the fact that the ABS measures the household budget, and transport today accounts for about 16% of the total household budget. That's the second highest, just after rent or sort of mortgage costs. To give you a comparison, the sort of very vexed issue of electricity prices, electricity makes up about 3 or 4% of the average household budget. The fact that, of course, I won't get too much into some of the great work that's already in the report around the fact that it's our now second highest and fastest growing source of emissions. And in fact, it's one of our reports. So I try not to plug our own reports too much on your webinar here, Petra. But as we find as well, that as is the case in many countries, in Australia, the emissions that come out of our vehicles cause more deaths every year than crashes on our roads. So again, it's time to look at what are we going here, what is the status quo, and what are the benefits, and how does that make worthwhile the pain that we have to go through in transitions. And I'm sure we're about to hear about a bit of pain going through transitions from Terry next. So I may let him go on and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those remarks, Behyad. Certainly lots to think about there and some amazing stats. Just a reminder to everyone, if you've got a question, you can post it using the Q&A button, and it's fantastic to see so many questions coming through already. I'll now ask Terry Bickerton from Australia Post to talk to us for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Petra. I guess the Australia Post has gone through an interesting transition. We were reasonably early adopters of electric vehicle technology. We've also been early trialers of the fuel type in its earlier form, and it's interesting to see the vehicles change as quickly as they have. So if I can't see the presentation from my end, so if we can bring up the presentation, that'd be great. Next slide, please. So what we've done is we did a 4-year trial on the first available commercial vehicle that was introduced into Australia, and unfortunately is still the only OEM commercial vehicle available in Australia. The Renault Kangoo, which was a plug-in battery electric, which we've trialled in New South Wales and Victoria for some 4 years. That gave us a lot of learnings on charge cycles, battery times, run times, etc. We then introduced a new delivery mode, which is a three-wheeled battery electric, to start to look at the replacement of motorcycles. That replacement was because of the parcel sizes becoming larger. We needed another vehicle for that type of deployment, and obviously electric was the future of that type of vehicle. So we trialled that with 100 vehicles. We've deployed 1,000 of those currently, and we have another 1,000 that we are currently in the throes of deploying throughout Australia. So we'll have about 2,200 of those on the road. As well as those, we have electric push bikes, which are, compared to the traditional push bike, these are able to be driven further and operated further with greater loads without the riders looking like an Olympic athlete at the end of the day. So it also allows them to travel much further. We've also been moving into electric drive forklift, which we run one of the largest, or if not the largest, fleet of forklifts in Australia. Primarily, those are a mix of electric and LPG, with the highest percentage, about 70% of those vehicles are electric. So we've also now moved into an autonomous electric drive fork truck. These are self-aware. They're artificial intelligent vehicles which will charge themselves. They also work to demand loading, etc. They've been deployed, about 23 of those, into our new Redbank facility. We're also looking at and working with a number of EV suppliers globally, from around the world, with EV suppliers, and the one on the picture the picture in the slide is called the Arrival, which was trialled by Royal Mail. So we're looking to trial exactly the same vehicle here once things free up. We're also working with the likes of Toyota and Volvo and Tesla and Thor and a whole host of other manufacturers. Next slide, please.
Terry, Petra here. We're just getting a bit of scratchy sound from your end. I don't know if you can move closer to the computer or...
No, it's actually on my head, so it's possibly me rubbing on my jacket. So that's just a little bit of a rollout with the electric vehicles, some of the findings and the trials. We've also been large introducers of solar panels. We have a significant quantity of solar panels on most of our large facilities. These are used to feed back into the network, but we're also looking at how we charge our battery electric vehicles from these solar panels, and how they can be used to charge accessory battery packs to then discharge back into the vehicles. Next slide, please. So we're also looking at what else is in the future. It's not just purely around electric vehicles. It's also around hydrogen and the ability of large capacity vehicles to be transitioned into hydrogen, which seems to be the more likely technology for long distance applications. I guess right now, if I look at what is available in Australia, there are currently no OEM vehicles, commercial vehicles available in the country for sale. There are a couple of FUSOs that are coming. There are a number of conversions which are literally that are converted from an original equipment vehicle where it's had the diesel engine removed and an electrical power pack put in its place. So we're looking and monitoring where we go from there. We're also looking at how we transition in our passenger car fleet with the available models, particularly when you look at the average small passenger vehicle, which is reasonably competitively priced. If you look at that compared to its electric counterpart, the similarities become more difficult to achieve. Distances travelled are not as great. The resale value on these vehicles, the market isn't yet ready to adopt these vehicles, so that the prices are quite low. The cost of these vehicles from new is sometimes prohibitively high, and the range of models in those vehicles from those manufacturers are quite limited. So there's a little way to go yet, but I think we're certainly on the right path. Can I have the next slide, please? So we've transitioned in a number of ways with electric vehicles, but it's from those learnings where we're starting to see a number of safety focuses that help us reduce these exposures, particularly with the larger vehicles that we're using to replace electric vehicles, the motorcycles, sorry, with electric vehicles. They're also a much safer vehicle for the operator to use, less stressful on the riders, as well as being more emissions friendly for the vehicles. So next slide. I think that's the last slide. One more. Again, this is looking at how we transition and how we best use the power that we generate on our solar panels. Looking at how we reduce the loads on those vehicles, low consumption LED lighting, low rolling resistance tyres, increased aerodynamics. All of these help us use less or consume less power in these vehicles, so it allows us to travel further with smaller charges, lighter batteries, etc. So I think that is the last slide. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Terry. Once again, just to let you know, if you do have a question about anything Terry or Behyad has said, you can use the Q&A function, and I can see there's lots of questions coming through already. Let me just kick things off with a couple of questions for Terry and Behyad, and then we'll go to some of your audience questions. So perhaps, Behyad, one of the things we found interesting when we were preparing our Moving to Zero report is that so many solutions in the transport space have been around for a long time and are well established, things like, you know, electric public transport, electric cars, buses, obviously getting people out of their private vehicles and onto public transport. How far can we go in terms of cutting emissions with these established technologies in transport, and how much do we still need to focus on those, like, I guess, you know, how much can we cut transport emissions purely with those solutions that are ready to roll out?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let's start first with you mentioned some of them have been around for a quite long time. And when we look at that in terms of, it really, it's what is your market incentivizing you to do? What's it encouraging in terms of the shape of your market? That goes everything from, which I won't touch on, but how you build your cities to encourage people to ride bicycles, walk, use sort of multimodal transport systems. So get a bus or a train, and then, you know, maybe drive a car to your train and then move on. But then looking at technologies, and particularly looking at things like more fuel efficient vehicles, and now more recently electric vehicles. So thinking about how long these things have been in place, how most markets encourage people to purchase a more fuel efficient or electric vehicle is through an underlying piece of regulation. Really, it's a vehicle CO2 regulation, variously in Australia called a fuel efficiency regulation or a corporate average fleet emissions. So it has a different name everywhere you go. When we talk about it being around for a long time, the US implemented theirs in 1976. Now, more recently, coupling those sort of things up with incentives for electric vehicles, they've been introduced, I think, first in Japan around 1996, and certainly within the last decade by the EU, the US, and sort of every other developed economy, actually, bar Australia. So again, it's looking at, you know, and I mention all of that because Australia has none of that in place at the moment. So looking at what is possible, really that question is, are you encouraging people to buy the most fuel efficient vehicle and reflecting that in the price? That of course has an economic benefit to the consumer as well. If it's a car we're talking about, the car they purchase that's more fuel efficient means that it requires less petrol or electricity to run, costing them less over the lifetime of it. But what we know about consumers is they care a lot about the price that's on the sticker. Some of that is sort of sentiment based, some of that is very practical. If somebody only has $30,000 to spend, it doesn't matter if the $40,000 car is more efficient for them and cost them less over 10 years, they only have $30,000 to spend. So again, not having those type of measures in place actually actively encourages people to buy what's otherwise the cheapest vehicle that's available and what's otherwise the least efficient vehicle. So the customer has to end up paying a lot more to travel every day or every year. And of course, they're releasing more emissions, releasing more pollution as they do so. Then, I mean, separately, now looking at the technology where it is today, it's where we're able to see, for instance, entire cities overseas shifting their fleets, their bus fleets, their public transport fleets to electric. They're able to see that with the right measures being put in place, that electric buses are actually already cost competitive. That tipping point has already occurred for electric buses. What's not competitive, though, is the effort required in that transition. So something really important here, I mean, Terry will be able to speak to this a lot more as well, is for that person who's trying to operate a transit fleet, or, you know, Terry will talk more about a sort of postal and logistics fleet, we're not for them just talking about a new vehicle, but we're talking about a new technology. It's a lot more like imagining how your company's IT departments act when they need to roll out a new operating system or move from typewriters to computers for the first time. It's not just about replacing the old with the new, but actually getting your head around the new technology and then all of the teething issues that occur. That's that challenge there on not, when we talk about sort of waiting for emerging technology, is not hoping that there's an emerging technology that just makes everything easy and requires no work on our part. It's recognizing they're all going to be difficult and require some work on our part, but that work is worth doing in order to reach a beneficial outcome. So yeah, when we start to look at where can our light vehicle fleet be, certainly, you know, as I mentioned, we're about 10 times behind the rest of the world in electrification. We're about 2/3 behind the rest of the world in just fuel efficiency of vehicles, so even in petrol technology and the quality of our fuel. And then if we start to look at some of those key segments inside of the diesel sector, things like the buses running along our roads, we can certainly start to eliminate those and start to transition those to electric as well. Provides a really key benefit for us, both in terms of the emissions they release that have an environmental harm, but as I mentioned earlier as well, particularly around the public health impact that they have. Because of course, there's an area where, unfortunately, the averages lie to us sometimes. If we try to count particulates across an entire year, it really doesn't, well, it does matter, but it doesn't matter as much, you know, how much NOx, for instance, is released at 2 a.m., you know, on some hill where we have some measuring technology. It's how many buses are there at a bus bay at a school when everybody's dropping off their kids all at the same time, where the sort of most vulnerable population is breathing in quite a lot of diesel fumes. It's there we're able to see that the impacts of not transitioning are actually magnified.
Thanks, Bad. I think one of the interesting things about the coronavirus is you talked about sort of the pain of transition, but actually what we've seen is governments, business and individuals change their habits incredibly quickly because they've had to. And I think people have experienced firsthand some of those benefits of quieter streets and less air pollution and so on. I wonder, Terry, do you think that the COVID-19 restrictions and is this going to change the way Australians think about transport? And do you think this will make the transition towards net zero emissions harder or more easy?
That's an interesting question, Petra, because whilst the goal is for everybody to transition towards zero emission vehicles. Unfortunately, right at the moment where COVID has forced everybody into an online buying patterns, which has accelerated the online buying trends for Australia, that has then increased the requirement for transport and logistics to deliver those parcels and to move those parcels around. Unfortunately, that technology right at the moment is internal combustion engines. We're moving more and more product onto freight, onto freight trains. So moving those in larger volumes with less emissions on that perspective. But the more that the retailers push for faster delivery times and quicker turnarounds, that then forces us and our other competitors within the market to look at, well, what is the only option that we have is to use the vehicles that we have available to us right now. If we're talking about fast transit times from city to city, the only way to do that is in an aircraft. And then to distribute those out using internal combustion vehicles, which right now we're running shift after shift after shift. So there is no time for electric vehicles in their current status, and certainly fast chargers, etc., will change that in the future. But right now it is drive in, refuel, reload, go again, and that continues over and over and over. So that's sort of the challenge. I don't think it will transform right now, but I certainly think it will be where it needs to be future-wise. I guess the only thing that concerns me is that the more reliance we have on the likes of plug-in battery electrics, which seems to be the most common at this point in time, we're plugging them into very large coal-fired power stations. So it stops the emissions from the small vehicle and pushes it down to the road to a very large power station that's consuming coal. So yeah, the trade-off isn't ideal, but it's certainly there. Onto those commercial vehicles, a lot of these commercial vehicles right now, if you look at it, other than the slight reduction in maintenance for these vehicles, and the reduction in fuel burn or the amount of fuel that you need to put into them, because it still costs you any fuel of some sort, there is no benefit to running those vehicles. They cost on average twice the amount that the internal combustion vehicle carries. They give up weight compared to the carrying capacity of its internal combustion competitor, and their travel distance is much lower. And then when you come to resell that vehicle, the market isn't ready at this stage to accept them, and so the resale value of that vehicle is unsure. I think part of that is driven around the fact that there's not enough education by the people, and this also goes into the passenger car market. You won't see any advertising, with the exception of the Nissan Leaf, for passenger vehicles on the market. So the general populace is not well educated on the benefits, etc. So that's another problem that we need to do. So.
Well, I might take that opportunity to ask Behyad to educate us on some of the benefits of electric vehicles, perhaps particularly cars. And I might also get you to respond to what Terry was talking about in terms of emissions. What are the benefits of electric vehicles in terms of cost and emissions?
Yeah, happy to do that. So look, I think there are a few things there. Why don't I start with emissions, and then we'll get into everything else. Really, if you're in the market looking for an electric vehicle and wondering about that impact of is it charging based on coal? I think the good news is that for the first time, all of the power can be in your hands. You can just purchase 100% renewable energy, and there you go, you're at zero emissions. And that's where we try to separate out, I guess, the micro from the macro, right? So if you're an environmentally conscious consumer and you want to drive the least emission or the most emission friendly vehicle ever, purchase an electric vehicle, charge it using renewable energy, and off you go. The other question and the policy discussion is well, if we transition our entire country towards electric vehicles, and then you have a whole range of consumers, people who aren't going to go out of their way to purchase electric vehicles, will just be using the grid average. Then are electric vehicles better? They're already, yes, like for like, they are better. Now, better, unfortunately, isn't, doesn't mean that they're perfect, because there is some coal there. Remembering, in one case, we're comparing it to a 100% fossil fuel source as opposed to I think now 78% fossil fuel source from our electricity grid. But then also, I think really importantly, and I'll just stick to cars for a moment here, for instance, if you imagine a car stays on the road for about 10 to 12 years, what we're able to see is even this government's willing to admit now that we are on a trajectory under business as usual towards 50% renewable energy by 2030. So what's really important there, and some of the sort of existing, Terry spoke about consumer awareness, some of the existing tools that are available from the government do things like tell you how much emissions a car releases today, because it's a tool that was built around petrol and diesel vehicles. So you can look at it and it'll tell you, if you buy this car, every kilometre that you drive, these are the emissions that they release. It's no longer suitable for electric vehicles, because obviously you can decide to change that. But also every year you continue holding on to the car, the grid will get cleaner and you'll be consuming less emissions as you go. So really importantly, that's not a different car, that's the same car getting cleaner as you continue to charge it from the grid right throughout. I'll just leave that there to a side and say, because I think there are a few questions about, are there economic benefits as well, or is this purely an emissions play? And really what I'd outline is, when I say sort of every other country in the G20 has an electric vehicle policy and electric vehicle incentives bar Australia, basically close to none of those are based purely on their on environmental concerns. There are two sets of economic benefits that we look at. One is direct. So things like Australia, for instance, has a net balance of trades impact of about $16 billion every year in importing liquid fuels for transport use to the country. Being able to replace that with a source of fuel that we generate domestically is better than, you don't need an economics degree. It's better to use the stuff you make yourself than to have to import something. There's a very direct impact there. When I mentioned those health impacts, important to realize that there is an economic impact to health. So we talk about nationally, and we haven't sort of updated these figures in a while because they're not regularly counted nationally. So we know it's gotten worse. We're talking about 1,715 early deaths every year as a result of breathing in vehicle emissions throughout your lifetime, and about somewhere between 4,000 to 8,000, which is a pretty wide thing, of major health impacts. So all of that, and you can imagine how an economist does this, you can't go to work, you can't earn money, you can't put money back into the economy, has a very real economic impact to a country as well. And then after that, there are a whole range of sort of indirect or sort of opportunity-based economic sort of opportunities as well. That's a whole range of things, from some of the things that we already have and supporting them. So we have companies here already making some form of electric vehicles, whether they're heavy or commercial vehicles based in Australia. Some of the world leaders, Tritium is the world leader in manufacturing electric vehicle charging infrastructure based in Australia. It's sort of looking at those green shoots and saying, okay, well, we know that the entire world is transitioning towards electric vehicles. What pieces of that economic pie can we carve out for ourselves and say we can start developing the software for grid integration for EVs? We can keep building more and more electric vehicle chargers, electric trucks. We often talk about the sort of unique nature of our landscape. That often means we have unique needs in vehicle use as well. One of the areas, fascinatingly enough, that's sort of leading some of fleet uptake in electric vehicles is the mining sector and the vehicles that they use on mine sites. These are sort of massive vehicles, all now transitioning to electric, both the benefit of far lower operating costs, but also not releasing emissions, particularly in confined spaces like mines as well. So a whole range there. I'm pretty sure I did address emissions at the beginning. I think the key thing to look for when you read other opinions on emissions as well, you'll often see a comparison of, this is where we say you sort of have to, if you're looking at it car by car, you have to make sure that comparing apples with apples. So sometimes we do see people doing things like comparing a Tesla Model S, which is a $130,000 to $180,000 sports car, charging from the grid, versus, for instance, a Toyota Prius, which is a $20,000 hybrid, sort of very economic family car, and saying, well, one of them would have worse emissions than the other. I think, well, what consumer are you imagining who's looking at a $120,000 sports car and could have bought a Prius instead? That's not the same person. So if you compare like for like, you see electric vehicles are already better, certainly continuing to get much better over time. But really importantly, it's up to you. You can make it zero right now.
Terry, a question from one of the audience. Have you communicated your electric vehicle strategy to your customers, to policymakers and staff? And what's been their response to the drive from Australia Post towards electric vehicles?
Certainly, we've communicated that in our environmental policy and our environmental emissions target. For that, we're also a member of the Australian Logistics Council and a number of government councils that advise government on these. We do look to trial for both Commonwealth government and for local governments. We have done extensive communications with the general public around the introduction of the EVs, the electric delivery vehicles. We did quite a high-level delivery list on those. So we can, when it's, and we do engage as much as we can when it's, I guess when it's valid for the business and valid for the. We don't want to be telling people every small step change that we do along the way, else we'd never get there. I guess a question for Behyad. One of the biggest issues that we struggle with as a country is that we are a very small market as far as vehicles go, and obviously there is a large drive from other manufacturers, or all of the manufacturers, to put their development budgets into those markets that obviously give them the best return. We see that as a bit of an issue in getting some traction to get those vehicles here. Again, as Behyad mentioned, right-hand drive, it's a very small market in the world globally anyway. So all of these things. Are you seeing the same thing with large vehicle manufacturers and heavy vehicle manufacturers, which are large fuel consumers? I've been knocking on a number of those manufacturers' doors for some time and pulling as many levers as I can to try and get those vehicles here, but I'm just not seeing any traction. If I look at Volvo, for example, released electric vehicles into the European marketplace some 18 months ago. Mercedes have had a couple on the boil for a little while. I've had the small Japanese trucks on trial, but they are exactly that. They're small Japanese trucks. We've been talking to both Tesla and a couple of other large truck manufacturers in the US. Both, whilst they talk about it in the future, there's no real commitment to it there. Are you seeing the same thing? Because we're a little bit stumped by why they won't come.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think you've touched on the core of the issue. It's what I was discussing in the first place around model availability in different markets. Really, what we've got, because electric vehicles are the new technology, we've got a constrained supply of batteries being made at the moment, because the factories that build batteries are being built themselves. So there's only so many go around. And the question is, how does your marketplace get an allocation of electric vehicles? And so fascinatingly, size is actually less of an issue for us. It's sort of effort otherwise. So before COVID, we used to sell a bit over 1 million vehicles in Australia. It's about 11th largest in the world if you consider the EU to be one market. So sizes in turn, that's quite lucrative. While we're a smaller country, we're hiring, we're a first world nation, higher income earning, higher educated, more disposable income for people to purchase more expensive vehicles, which is seen as very lucrative. But as I mentioned, what we have around the world is a set of countries who place regulatory requirements essentially for a manufacturer to sell electric vehicles into their market. It's not specifically electric vehicles. It's usually you have to hit this CO2 target, and to hit it, you would have to sell electric vehicles. And coupled with incentives for consumers. Some other countries who still have the regulation in place that isn't as strict, but then also provide incentives. So for the car company, they're saying, I'm just going to make up a number here. We have 100,000 electric vehicles to go around the world. Where do we have what we call bankable demand? Where are we sure that we're going to be able to sell these vehicles? Or where do we have to sell the vehicles, regardless of whether or not we're sure? They're going to get their allocation. And then what's left everywhere else? And the unfortunate thing is that not only do we fall in the what's left everywhere else category, but you can't express enough that doing nothing is a very active decision by our part, because what we've just seen very recently in response to COVID is all of those other countries continue to accelerate their efforts. So they continue to tighten their emissions restrictions. They continue to increase the amount of incentives available for electric vehicles or supporting technology. So that may be anything from installing charging stations to going to businesses like yours saying, what do we need to do to make you go fully electric? How can we help you get it done? So similarly, when an OEM does a scan around the world, they're saying, where should we be putting these things? And we're obviously going to go to the places where we have governments that are begging us to come and invest our funds there. Because they do know, it's what I touched on earlier, look, they know for sure that the shift towards fully electric is coming at some point in the future. Everything else is an argument about where will different markets land within that timeline of going from 0 to 100%. And all of those countries are saying the sooner that we can be further along that timeline, the sooner we can sprout industries that support this global transition and have this one-off opportunity. It's, for instance, what's driven a lot of the activity out of China that said that we probably couldn't compete in the internal combustion engine manufacturing world because we have entrenched players that have been there for too long and they're doing too well, they have all the relationships. But given this technology change is occurring, we can probably compete in electric vehicles. And so now some of the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturers are all based out of China, and everyone else certainly has planar operations in China as well. So it's really that gap of why is it so hard? It's because everybody else is competing for an allocation, and unfortunately we're not nationally. It's up to, I think the good part is that it's up to businesses like yours and people like us to be as good a cheerleader as possible and try to get at least some level of change to occur, but certainly made a lot more difficult without there being a national policy in place.
So speaking of national policy, and we're nearly out of time, but I might try and squeeze in one very quick last comment from Behyad and Terry. The National Cabinet has set transport as one of its focus areas, and of course the Commonwealth Government has committed to developing an electric vehicle strategy. What do we hope to see out of this focus on transport to help both business and Australia's take-up of electric vehicles? Just a very quick comment from Behyad and then Terry.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk a bit about what I would like to see, which I've spoken a bit around, those key pillars of emissions regulations, incentive support, financial support for people to transition fleets to electric, examples like Terry's. What we're much more likely to see, I think, is some level of financial support or otherwise in encouraging private investment in charging infrastructure, which is useful. It doesn't do everything. Certainly in terms of the National Electric Vehicle Strategy, the first step of that, the consultation paper, was first due last November, and it's continued to be delayed every month since. We're now delayed thanks to COVID. It's a very timely excuse. Unfortunately, what we see too often is governments focusing, and I think what the National Electric Vehicle Strategy will unfortunately do is focusing on what measures should be taken once electric vehicles have arrived and everybody's driving them, as opposed to what every other country does, which is how do we make sure they do arrive and get people to drive them in the first place.
Thanks. And Terry, what do you hope to see from governments to support organisations like Australia Post to transition?
I think we need to or the government needs to incentivise the purchase of vehicles to try and somehow offset the manufacturing cost or the sales price of vehicles. And I use that as a broad brush, be it passenger vehicles or commercials or heavy commercials. We look at it in the same way as Europe has done, where you get reduced tolling, you get reduced registration costs, you get reduced, there's no emissions tax to enter larger cities. All of those things then add to support the take up of these electric vehicles. In heavy vehicles, for example, the trade-off on capacity of the vehicle, they're heavier because of the battery. We need to have some relaxation on some of the weights compared to their diesel variants to try and get the same trade-off. You'd be horrified if you saw my e-tag bill for the month. So if we can get some incentives to run electric vehicles and get some reductions in registration costs, etc., I think that would go a long way to try and assist with that.
Thanks, Behyad and Terry. Some great suggestions, and of course highlighting that we do need to focus on reducing emissions from our transport sector, and there's lots of ways that Australia can help transport get to zero emissions in our Moving to Zero Transport report, which you can get on our website. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, and we barely got through a handful of the questions. It was so great to see the engagement from the audience. Before we go, I just want to remind you that the next briefing room event is coming up on land on the 24th of June. So keep an eye on your emails if you want to join that event. And you can also check out the ClimateWorks Australia.org website for more information. Thanks so much to our two panellists for this excellent discussion. So thanks to Behyad Jafari from the Electric Vehicle Council and Terry Bickerton from Australia Post. And I'd also like to thank Michael Lee, who's the Senior Project Manager at ClimateWorks, and Lilith and Sophie, who've been coordinating all the technical aspects of this webinar today. We've had over 250 people join this event today, so wonderful to see so much interest in getting transport emissions down to zero. Thanks to everyone for attending and for all those questions, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.